Good morning, everyone. This is Kimberly Horndeski with the Comptroller's Office, here with Cliff Shackelford from Texas Parks and Wildlife. Thank you guys for coming to our webinar on the Black Rail. Right now, you're looking at a picture provided by Woody Woodrow. Thank you so much for taking that picture, Woody. It was from one of our very first Black Rail meetings in Lake Jackson, and I thought it was kind of a perfect picture to put up there because this is going to be that's from our first working group meeting, and this is going to be my very last webinar working group meeting with you guys. So thank you for all of your support. I really appreciate it. Today we have two presenters. We're going to first have Whitney Weiss, and then we're going to have Liza from Colorado. Before we get started, though, I do have a couple housekeeping items that I do want to talk to you about. First, this webinar, we're trying to record it and hopefully we'll be able to distribute it afterwards. So do keep that in mind. The second thing is we are going to try to do questions because there's a challenge with using technology, the microphones, and making sure that we can hear everybody and all of that fun stuff. What we're going to do is have everybody try to write in their questions, and we're going to read out the question, and then the presenter can answer them. If your questions are not answered, please feel free to email, well, I would say Cliff at this point, and I'm sure that he'll be able to coordinate with each of the presenters and they can get you the answer at a later date. Other than that, I'm going to have you guys on mute the entire time so we don't have to hear rustling of papers or music or eating potato chips or any fun things like that. And if you have any questions at any point, please let Cliff know from this point on. We're going to get started. So first up, we're going to have Whitney. I'm going to change over to you really fast, Whitney, so she can get her presentation up and running. If you guys don't know Whitney, she is an amazing individual to work with. I've been working with her for the past 2 years at least, and she has been quite kind in answering all of my questions. She's been very patient and she's very knowledgeable about the Black Rail in particular. And I don't think we could have done any of this work without her. So she's going to give us a brief overview of the listing process and what happens for Fish and Wildlife Service. So she is a wealth of information. And Whitney, can you please tell me what your new last name is?
Sure, it's Beisler.
Beisler. I didn't want to mispronounce it.
Beisler.
Congratulations,
no problem.
By the way. And if you wouldn't mind, off you go.
Yeah, so thank you, Kimberly and Cliff, for putting this together, a very timely webinar. And just thanks again to Kimberly for really working so hard for us the last couple of years in establishing a good group in Texas and the greater Gulf and Great Plains. So she put us off on a good foot, I think. So my presentation is going to be a bit about Section 4, which is our listing section in the Endangered Species Act, and how it's been applied to the Eastern Black Rail. And for summer, okay, there we go. So just for quick overview, I apologize for the pixelated quality of this figure, but so Section 4 of the Endangered Species Act sets our requirements and standards for listing, and then there are several provisions within that provides citizen petitions, talks about recovery planning, designating critical habitat, and also allows for 4D rules, which identify protective regulations for threatened species specifically. And so the graphic on the left shows the two different ways that the service can reach a listing, through our discretionary review process or for the petition process. And we're going to focus on the petition process because that relates to Eastern Black Rail. So Eastern Black Rail is a petition species, and that's up in the red on the upper right. And so when we receive a petition for Black Rail that happened in 2010, our next step is to make a 90-day finding on the petition if further action is warranted, which we made in 2011 that we found substantial finding for the 90-day finding, which then kicked us into initiating a status review for the species. And so several of you already know there was a lot of backlog for workload and several court cases. And so we really did not initiate a formal status review until July 2017 last year, when we kicked off our SSA process. And so undertaking the SSA for the Eastern Black Rail, that process informs our 12-month finding, which we then make a listing decision based on. And so our 12-month finding can be not warranted, warranted but precluded, or warranted, in which case, if it is warranted, then we generally go straight into a proposed rule. And once the proposed rule is published, that automatically opens the 60-day public comment period. And the ESA provides the service with 1 year between issuing the proposed rule and either finalizing the listing or withdrawing it. Okay. And so this SSA process has been a really important transformation to the listing program. And so over the past several years, the listing program has worked to essentially flip the pyramid, meaning attempted to make the scientific analysis that we do more explicit and transparent. We've worked to reallocate staff and funding resources from the previously heavy review phase, in the red here, to the actual scientific and decision analysis phase, the green on the right. We use teams now to complete work products, where previously it was often a sole biologist working very hard alone in their office for a long time. And with all of this, we work to improve communication within our own program here for Listing as a Service, but also throughout the greater service agency, and with all of our external partners, like our state wildlife agencies and NGOs. And so some of the ways that we've worked to flip this pyramid are by developing a national work plan that prioritizes species through a binning process, and by doing these SSAs, or species status assessments, that assess the biological status of a species. And just so not everyone's confused, sometimes when I refer to species here, it's the definition that's actually in Section 3 of our Act, which refers to either a species or a subspecies of fish or wildlife and plants, or it could, in some cases, refer to a distinct population segment of a vertebrate fish or wildlife species. And so the SSA has been a really key change, and the underpinning for all, hopefully from now into the future, are ESA decision-making processes. And so after 40 years of implementing the Endangered Species Act, the service realized that it was time for an improved assessment process that would build on the experience from the past, but also address present concerns with listing, and work for conservation in the future. And so many of you might be familiar with the 5-factor analysis that was done the previous past 40 years. And those 5 factors, such as habitat loss, or disease, predation, those are straight from the Act. But we realized that we could do this more rigorous and transparent SSA process to evaluate future threats and risk to species, and if they'd be able to sustain populations in the wild into the future. And so everyone talks about the SSA these days, and many of you, I'm sure, have seen this, but the infographic on the right shows the 3 fundamental stages now that we go through when we're looking to complete an SSA for a species. First is the species needs. So we compile and analyze information on the life history and ecological relationships that species has. And then we move into evaluating the current condition of the species. So what state is it in now, and why do we think it's in that state? And then looking at forecasting. So looking at what the future condition of the species might be when we look at all the different threats and do a risk assessment of those threats. And so it's built on the conservation biology principles of the 3 R's: resiliency, representation, and redundancy. Resiliency being the ability of the species to withstand stochastic events, redundancy, the ability of species to withstand catastrophic events, and then representation refers to adaptive capacity, or the ability of species to adapt to changing environmental conditions. So along with the development of the SSA framework, we've worked to improve our entire workflow, including additional objectives for transparency and consistency, not only for the analysis phase, but from start to finish of our workflow. So from project planning on the left-hand side of this graphic, all the way to the final signature surname process by the Fish and Wildlife Service Director on the right. So this change in process supported the distinct science phase that we have right in that big box, where we can collaborate on the SSA with states and other experts on the true science of the species. And it's very important to realize that this is a separate decision phase in our workflow. And so it's always important to remember when you see an SSA that it is not a decision document. So those 2 things are very separate. And so the separation between those may seem subtle at times, but it's a really key one. When we are able to keep the SSA as strictly a science piece, we get several benefits from that. That we can more objectively approach the SSA. We can work to avoid bias and preconceived assumptions about what an ESA decision maybe should be. And hopefully it just contains just the facts. And so this really enhances our opportunity to work with states and tribes and other federal agencies, NGOs, and academia in better understanding all the science surrounded our species at multiple levels. And so this diagram shows by the respective size of the boxes that we strive to spend the bulk of our time on the science, just like how that pyramid on the right-hand side, it was largest at the bottom, the science and the analysis portion. And in an effort to kind of communicate this change in our process of SSAs and how they relate to ESA decision-making, we've attempted to put additional information that's readily available to the public about this. And so if you're interested in kind of reading about the history and where we're at now with this part of the workflow process that we do in the service, you can visit these 2 websites listed on the screen for more information. And also earlier this year, there was a manuscript that was published on the SSA process and its application to ESA decision-making. And so that is in the Journal of Fish and Wildlife Management. And I'm also happy to send that to Kimberly and Cliff. Maybe they can distribute it after this webinar is over. Okay. And so as I mentioned before, one of the improvements the service made was to develop a national listing work plan. And this plan is available on our website. The site's here at the top of this slide. And this first plan was a 7-year work plan that was completed in September 2016. And so I circled the row down here at the bottom that pertains to the black rail. And so at first, when I first started looking at the petition, the petitioners referred to the full species scientific name in the petition, but the content and the reasoning that they included for why the species should be evaluated was very specific to the eastern subspecies. And so in 2015, we confirmed with the petitioners that they were only petitioning the eastern subspecies, which is known as the eastern black rail. And so that's a really important distinction, because if they were petitioning us on the full species, then we would also be evaluating how birds were doing in California and Arizona, which is a different subspecies, the California subspecies of black rail, and also the 2 other subspecies that are found in South America. And so it really would have changed, you know, the scope of our SSA for this bird. But they did confirm it was the eastern subspecies. But at the time, some of you will notice on the right, and now this will kind of link into Liza's presentation, that there are not many states listed on the right-hand side under the range in this initial version of the work plan from September 2016. So many key states that the eastern black rail is known from, like Maryland and New Jersey, Colorado, are missing from the initial work plan, probably partly due to what the petitioners contained in their petition and just resources at headquarters level at the time. This petition contains, this work plan contains over 500 species. And so, unfortunately, the many states were initially omitted from this work plan, even though we were evaluating them for our eastern black rail SSA. And I mention this because, you know, states rely on our work plan now to plan, you know, what surveys they might do to help provide us with information as we're going through this process. And so, unfortunately, some of the Western states and others were left off and, you know, kind of realized communication late that we also were looking at black rail in their states. And so that messed up the timing, which I know many people have asked me why Colorado information isn't in our report yet. And part of that is because of this miscommunication on the work plan and surveys starting just this past year. So we've, over the past year or so, tried to, each time I know there's a new work plan revision, tried to rectify this. And so in our February 2018 version, you know, we switched it to Eastern Black Rail here. You can see a lot more states are listed, also Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. But it seemed to be a bit of a moving target for a little bit. And so even a few are missing from this, but our ECOS webpage, which some of you may know, shows all the states we're looking at, and that should now be fully correct. And so hopefully in any future versions, we've got everybody covered. But I wanted to make that note before Liza jumps into her talk. And so I've already mentioned some of these dates that this process started in 2010 with the petition for the Eastern Black Rail, followed by the 90-day finding, and then kicking off our species status assessment in July 2017 of last year, and also with reference to timeline and work process to, my apologies, with Liza's work. Colorado is still doing their first surveys in the spring of this year, but in June, that was also the same time that we were finalizing the current version of the SSA. And so when you see the version up on regulations.gov, that is the reason that we don't have preliminary Colorado survey information in the version that you'll be seeing next week. But as we said before, the SSA is a living document, and so all the Colorado preliminary information and any new survey information that is submitted to us will be updating the Eastern Black Rail SSA, and that will get included in future versions of the report. And so our petition deadline to do a 12-month finding was September 30th, 2018, so just this past Sunday. We had a court settlement deadline to submit to the Federal Register. And so now, I'll get back to that in a minute. Might gloss over this real quick, but in the SSA analysis, just to refamiliarize yourself a little bit in anticipation of hopefully downloading it next week, we identified the primary resource needs of our eastern black rail, that it's a wetland-dependent species. What are the primary stressors to our species? So habitat loss and degradation, sea level rise, different stochastic events, as well as incompatible land management. So fire done, prescribed burning done at times that aren't good for the eastern black rail life history, particularly during nesting and brooding of chicks. So land management's a key one, where we know that it's a really, really important thing to have happen to maintain habitat in a suitable state for these birds. Just when these things are done at different times or frequencies or densities, it can have detrimental effects for the birds. And then we also moved into analyzing the current condition and future condition by developing scenarios, as outlined in that framework infographic. And we contracted with the U.S. Geological Survey to do occupancy and projection modeling to look at the current condition and future condition pieces. Many of you saw the version 1.0 report back in January when I sent it to a very large list for partner review. At that time, we also sent it to 10 potential peer reviewers, and we received responses back from 5 peer reviewers. So the version you'll see on Tuesday on regulations.gov is version 1.3. We've been doing some updating since you've seen it in January. And if my slide changes, we do have a docket number for you. It's FWS-R4-ES. ES stands for Ecological Services, our division, -2018-0057. So as of tomorrow morning, the document will be placed on public inspection, which is a site on the Federal Register's website. And this means that the Word document version of our proposed listing rule is available for the public. Monday is a federal holiday, so on Tuesday, October 9th, our proposed listing rule will be officially published in the Federal Register in the format that you see. So, and I also put up the link for after the date of publication of October 9th, they immediately move it to a different site, this one at the bottom. But many of you, I'm sure, are on our contact grid list and will be getting emails when everything is posted. And I believe that, yep, that's all I've got. So hopefully some repeat information that was helpful, but also some new information that was helpful for everyone as well.
Thank you so much, Whitney. That was quite helpful, as always, with you. I do have a question for you, considering, well, no one else has written a question as of yet. My question would be, do you guys have, so Cliff and I have the ability to share information with large number of stakeholders that might be interested in this and have knowledge and expertise in black rail and management and all those sorts of things. Do you, by chance, have any questions or comments that you would like clarification for with the coming document being posted? Is there anything, or is this too soon to ask that?
Just a little too soon to ask.
Okay.
But I appreciate it, and I do think we can definitely talk about tomorrow, perhaps,
Okay.
you know, ways to better engage, you know, people with the expertise for some things that might be helpful.
Okay. Didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Thanks, Kimberly. No worries.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions for Whitney? You'd have to type them in and we can read them out loud. Right now, we don't see anything.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay.
Which I just clicked.
Not a problem. Well, if you guys do have any questions later, please do just email Cliff and I'm sure, or Whitney, and I'm sure that they will be happy to answer those. One moment. Okay. Okay.
Okay, next up we have Liza Rossi. She's the Avian Conservation Coordinator for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. So take it away, Liza.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, and can you see my screen also?
It's Eastern Black Rail occupancy in the southeastern Colorado results from 2018 pilot study.
Yeah, that's it.
Perfect. Yes, we do see it. Okay,
great. Thanks. Well, I just wanted to say hello to everyone on the webinar, and just I'm glad to be here to talk about some of our findings or results from a 2018 pilot survey that we did this last spring. And before going further, I just really want to acknowledge that this was a collaborative effort. I'm the Avian Conservation Coordinator for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, but work broadly within our agency. I worked with our statistician, John Runge, on this project, as well as biologists and officers in the field, and then had a technician who did a lot of the surveys, and really want to acknowledge his work since he spent a lot of time surveying throughout the night. Oops. So now I'm trying to move forward. Screen is not moving forward. Sorry about this. It was working. Oh, there it goes. Okay. So this is a figure I think many of you have seen, and really the point of this was to kind of have the discussion that Whitney actually just went over earlier, that Colorado is in this really kind of little tip of what's shown as the breeding distribution. And although our agency was aware that we had black rails in southeastern Colorado, we were not aware of really the listing process, and really weren't aware of it until the 7-year work plan came out that Whitney mentioned. However, at that point, she said Colorado wasn't listed as a state that would be affected, and we weren't listed on the ECOS webpage. So it really wasn't until later, and actually into 2017, with communication with the Services Region 6 office, that we understood that the birds in Colorado were going to be included in the status assessment and the 12-month finding. So with that, we are admittedly late to the game, but I do think that hopefully we've been able to gather some important information, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. So as Whitney said, the data call, they issued a data call in July 2017. And at that point, we really had very little data to provide. We had some eBird data, which is shown here, which the service had already compiled. And then we had some information from the second Colorado Breeding Bird Atlas. And I will note that the second Breeding Bird Atlas did include the black rail as a breeding bird in Colorado, but the first atlas only included it as a potential breeder. But the second Breeding Bird Atlas clearly said that we had potentially an important population in southeastern Colorado. So we provided that information to the service. And then, as Whitney said, the service released its draft SSA to the states and other partners. This is the image from the draft, so things may have changed in the recent version. But once the draft was released, it really highlighted, I think, to us as an agency, kind of how important data from the inland populations would be. We knew this before, but when we kind of looked at these broad analysis units, it was clear that although the service had some information from Kansas for the Great Plains analysis unit of the inland birds, that data from one or two sites is hard and can be problematic in terms of extrapolating across a much larger geographic area. So at that point, we kind of understood how important data would be from Colorado in terms of conservation management and some decision making. And as an agency, we committed to surveys in 2018 and let the service know that we would be doing surveys and that we would hope to get them information for the species status assessment. However, as Whitney said, we were doing our surveys and they were finalizing their SSA. So at this point, our data are not included in the SSA, but we have sent a summary report to the service. So they do have at least these preliminary findings from the pilot year. So we did initiate a survey in 2018. We focused our efforts in southeastern Colorado, which is really the area most likely to have black rails. These are where the majority of the eBird locations are, and where, from talking with local birders and interviews, that where we have the most birds. We focused on public lands, partially because we have some really good habitat on public lands, some of the larger marsh areas, but also because of kind of the listing uncertainty for the species. So we focused on state wildlife areas and state parks, Benfold Fort, and any other kind of public lands that are available, although this is really largely a private landscape. And then we had some selected conservation easements that we surveyed. So since many of you on the phone or on the webinar are maybe not from Colorado and further east, I wanted to just show a map of Colorado to orient you a little bit to the area I'm talking about. The southeastern region where our surveys were completed is the purple down in the right-hand corner. You can see that the mountains are all in the central and western part of the state, and the eastern third of Colorado really is a plains system, part of the southern Great Plains, largely a short grass prairie ecoregion. I wanted to also point out here, down in the southeast, this large river basin. It's the Arkansas River, and I'll be referencing that basin moving forward. Also pointing out here, this is I-25 heading from the south to the north, and most of our surveys were focused kind of east of I-25, although we did have a few just to the west near Pueblo. So as I mentioned previously, the land ownership on the Eastern Plains is largely private. We do have a good amount of public lands, BLM and Forest Service in the western and part in the mountains, but the Eastern Plains is largely private. So we focused our efforts on the small parcels of public lands that we had available. Our goal was to estimate black rail distribution in southeast Colorado using occupancy surveys and to determine the habitat associations in Colorado. Our specific objectives were to set up black rail survey routes and hoping to continue those into the future, to conduct multiple surveys. We're hoping for a minimum of 3 to estimate detection probability and occupancy, and to conduct some basic habitat sampling, trying to get at habitat associations because these areas are so different from many of the areas along the eastern seaboard where some of the research has been done. So in terms of our site selection, we worked with our GIS group to identify all emergent wetlands on public lands. And we did this using NWI mapping, and that was intersected with the public lands coverage. I did want to note that actually the Colorado Natural Heritage Program had recently digitized the NWI layer polygons and also updated some of the areas in the lower Arkansas River Basin, and that turned out to be important for us moving forward because they had updated some of the areas where we were working. We included all freshwater emergent wetland classes, all the PEM classes, regardless if they were either temporarily or permanently flooded. We just included them all to start. And then we did ground truth every potential site that had been identified to the GIS exercise. Some of them were no longer wetlands, and we did not survey those areas. We did add some sites from field knowledge, places where people knew of some large kind of cattail marshes. We added some that were not on the GIS layers. So in order to kind of help frame our surveys and help with the analysis later on, we defined a core area as the area within a 15-kilometer buffer from the Arkansas River on either side of the river. And this is from I-25 at Pueblo to the state line. So this is our core area. Everything outside of that area we defined as fringe habitats. And then we delineated marshes and estimated their size. This was a difficult kind of part of the project, I think, but we defined marshes as contiguous marsh habitat. So you can see in this photo here, this is where the marsh kind of extends around a little reservoir. And so the entire marsh would be included as a single marsh as long as it was contiguous, and the acreage would be defined, or the size would be defined that way. And we estimated the size regardless of land ownership. So although we were surveying on public land, if the marsh extended off of the public land, we estimated the size for the entire area. We used NWI polygons where they were deemed accurate, and as I said, some of the polygons seemed quite accurate because they were recently updated in 2015. Others that were mapped in the 1970s and 80s and then were not reflective of what was on the ground, and so in those cases we hand digitized the marshes using aerial photos. Whoops. Sorry. So this map just kind of shows you where we surveyed. That kind of pink in the area is what we're defining as core habitat. Those smaller purple areas are the individual marshes, and you can see we surveyed within the core habitat, but then also surveyed outside in the fringe habitat. We have a point down here and some points up here where we surveyed marshes. And again, this was all in southeastern Colorado. So we set up our surveys largely based on the National Marsh Bird Protocol from Conway, but I will note that I did make some modifications based on communication with Amanda Moore, and she was super helpful, so really appreciate all of her input. We had a 10-minute broadcast sequence with the first 5 minutes as a passive listening period, and then 5 minutes of species calls. Our focal species were black rail, least-spirited bittern, Sora, Virginia rail, and American bittern. We set up survey routes of 1 to 10 points that we could do in a survey, 2 to 3 hour survey. Although we were hoping to establish the points through GIS, we ended up having to establish them in the field. They were set along roads, ditches, and upland edges. So in this photo, the point broadcast would be kind of right at the edge, looking into the marsh. The points were set 400 meters apart to minimize double counting birds, and we used the same points throughout the survey period. We broadcast using Fox Pro units and did test the decibel levels on these units. So this was our first survey, as I've mentioned, so we didn't really know what to expect, but we followed the recommendation from the Marsh Bird Protocol that recommended April 15th through May 31st as the peak calling time. And this was actually also thought, I talked to some of the local birders and they felt like this would be a good time. And then we extended our surveys actually into June as well, because some of the local surveyors had found a lot of birds in June, or detected a lot of birds. And then we focused our surveys at dawn, dusk, and then we decided to try nighttime surveys. So for data, we recorded individual bird detections, and we did this for each minute of the 10-minute sequence. We recorded type of call and direction, and we estimated the distance band. This was something that we decided to do based on communication with Amanda Moore, and really made a lot of sense because we never saw any of these rails. We detected a whole lot, we heard a lot, but we never saw any. The habitat's super, super dense, and also a lot of our surveys were at night, so just didn't feel like we could be at all accurate in terms of estimating distance, but felt like we could get to within a pretty broad distance band. And you'll note this is actually the only bird photo, black rail photo, I have in the entire presentation, because we never saw one, so the rest are mostly habitat photos. But this is one that was actually taken of a bird in Colorado this last spring. So we conducted a habitat assessment, and in looking through the literature and all the documentation, I found that the habitat measurement methodology was much less kind of standardized than the call broadcast survey methods. So since this was a pilot year, we tried various things, pulled from different places, and we did kind of figure it out as we went. Because of that, we did not survey all of the points, but we did survey each point within the core area. And this was done at not during a call broadcast, but at a different visit to the site. So initially, we had kind of two scales of assessment. One was at the point where we were broadcasting and doing the point counts. So at that area, we made a really rough assessment. So what was the degree suitable habitat within 100 meters? That was really largely done using a compass. And we used wettest hydrology ranking based off of some work that Richmond et al. Had done, basically whether there was standing water or moist water. And then we tried to make a assessment also within 50 meters, so grouped the vegetation in broad categories. We recorded the first and second most dominant species, took photos in 4 cardinal directions, and made a sketch of the site, just really for reference later on. And we haven't worked out any of the results from the habitat assessment yet, but we're planning to do that as we move forward. Kind of finalizing, getting some results for the call surveys was our highest priority. So those are kind of the broad scale assessment at the point, and trying to get at parameters that might be important in terms of the call surveys and detection probabilities and occupancy. But we didn't feel like that really got at all at marsh measurements, or kind of what was the marsh like where the rails were using. So at each point, we also did 3 locations within the marsh. And it was different based on whether there was a black rail location there or not. If there was a black rail detected, we would project to that general area and start with our measurements there, and then go to 2 other random locations within the marsh in a random direction and distance. If there was no black rail present, we just did 3 random locations within the marsh and collected a variety of data. We did look at visual obstruction readings, and here I'll say that we did it at 2 meters rather than the usual 4 because the marshes were so dense. And as I just mentioned, we haven't looked at these data, but we plan to and hope to get some more information in terms of habitat associations with black rails in Colorado. So for the statistical analysis for the call broadcast surveys, and this is where really had a lot of help from John Runge, we used Program Mark, and then estimated occupancy using 3 parameters, and then estimated probability of detection using the parameters shown here on the screen. And I'll be talking about those as we move forward. And then in terms of results, so we established 115 broadcast points at 66 marshes. And really what I want you to take away from this screen is really that the larger marshes tended to be in the core habitat. So although the minimum size was 0.2 hectares for both fringe and core, about half an acre, the maximum for the core habitat is much larger, as well as kind of the average size. We had nearly a 400 hectare marsh in the core habitat, whereas the largest in the fringe was 26 hectares, an estimated 26 hectares. And again, just this is the same photo, but just wanted to give you a image again of where we surveyed, and you can see we're surveying in the core habitat, in the kind of tan area, and then in the fringe habitat. So we completed 380 broadcast surveys between April 22nd and June 13, 2018. And black rails were detected at 39 of 115 points and 17 of 66 marshes. We defined 3 nights as active nights, and this is something that in my discussions with the birders, they emphasize that black rails in southeastern Colorado have nights where they are just calling spontaneously and loudly, and we don't know why, but they are. It'd be great if we could figure out the variables that predict active nights. But during our surveys, we had 3 nights that we defined as active nights, and this is for the core area where we had a lot of rails. And just for an example, on May 24th was the night I was out there, and we surveyed kind of late at dusk, and then surveyed and then through the night, and stopped at points as we were heading back to the bunkhouse and counted 30 black rails just in that night with very, very little effort. So this is an area where on these active nights you can get a lot of black rail detections. You just basically have to stop on the side of the road and can hear them. But it's not like this every night. Only 3 nights in our survey period were like that. So these are the model selection results. This table only shows the top 10 models in relation to some more general models at the bottom. But what I want you to note is that the top model is really quite close to the second best model, and actually a couple of other ones. But what's different really is the time of day in the top model is where night and dusk are pooled and dawn is separate, whereas the second best model, the 3 survey periods are separated. So for the best model, and we reported results for this model because the results make sense, and also because the confidence intervals largely do not overlap 0. So for the parameters affecting detection probability, you can see there's a large positive effect from active nights. We did detect more birds based on Julian date as the surveys moved forward. Dawn had a lower detection probability compared to a pooled dusk and night time period of survey. And then in terms of occupancy, there was a positive effect if the site was in the core habitat, and then also size of marsh, estimated size of marsh had a positive effect as well. So this figure shows the logit scale estimates that are back transformed to the real scale estimates, just to kind of illustrate the effects of the parameters. And you can see here on active nights, which is a green line, really high detection probability. However, on more normal nights, and these are the nights we should plan for when doing surveys because you can't predict the active nights, We also had higher detection probability at dusk and night versus the dawn, which is the red line down below. And we did see actually an increase in detection probability as the surveys went on. So I think moving forward, we would survey, definitely keep surveying into June. In terms of occupancy, we found that, whether it was in core or fringe habitat, had a affected occupancy. In the core habitat, we had really pretty high site occupancy, even in really small areas. So 0.2 hectare marshes, we had a little over 50% occupancy. And then once you got to the larger marshes, you were almost sure to detect a black rail there on one of the visits. In terms of the fringe habitat, it is much lower, but also size of marsh was important in the fringe habitats as well. So to report some estimates so they'd be more comparable to some other studies, we looked at kind of average occupancy in core habitat. And this is what's shown up above. And we use the best model here without the size factor to generate these estimates. And so you can see in core habitat, our average occupancy is nearly 80%. In fringe habitat, it is lower, but we're encouraged that we were finding birds in the fringe habitats, and think that we'll probably be likely to see or be able to detect additional birds if we continue to survey in the fringe habitats. In terms of detection probability, I think the normal detection probability estimates are more informative than the active nights, but you can see for dusk and night, we had pretty decent detection probabilities. They're higher than some of the recent work done by Tolliver in Texas, but then our dawn detection probability was lower and more similar to some of the recent Texas work. And then active nights, probability just jumped up. So kind of in the future, where are we going? We're hoping to survey these same areas again so that we have 2 years of occupancy survey data, hoping that the data can then be used and incorporated in the Fish and Wildlife Service's species status assessment, looking at probability of extinction and colonization rates. We are discussing surveying across a broader area in eastern Colorado, possibly going to northeast Colorado or some other areas where we've got similar habitats. And to do this, we hope to develop a habitat suitability model to kind of inform our sampling frame and help in terms of choosing survey areas. We really do want to coordinate with other states and partners. We've had some initial discussions with Kansas, who is considering some surveys in the future years. And then one thing, and then this photo, you can see this kind of vast expanse of cattails. This is what some of our marshes look like. And we'd like to better understand how cattail management kind of affects black rails. These are areas, public wildlife areas that are managed for multiple species and waterfowl. So really like to understand cattail management, how we can manage for multiple species and also conserve black rails. And so with that, I think have a little time for questions. I've included my contact information here. And I do have a summary report that I provided to the Fish and Wildlife Service.
Great, thanks, Liza. And there's her email. Are you able to share that report with people that asked for it via email?
Yeah, I can do that. So if people are interested.
Great.
Yeah, and I will stress that these are the results from our pilot survey year, and we're hoping to get some more information moving in the future. But yeah, I'm happy to share the report.
I think it's great. It should inspire other states to do something similar. What you've done is really cool, Liza. Thank you. Any questions for Liza? I don't see any typed in. I have some, Liza. Could you tell us What were the conditions like during your nocturnal surveys in Colorado? I'm curious about biting insects, cool temperatures. Are you wearing jackets? I mean, that's not something we wear in May and June on the Texas coast. And did you have any curious humans? I'm guessing you're out there with headlamps and Q-beams and stuff, and I'm just curious about the biting insects, jackets, and crazy humans.
Well, we may have had some curious humans, but this is a area where there's a fairly low human population where we were surveying, and didn't really run into any issues there. They are cool nights, so generally, you know, we were in jackets. However, we have really nice survey conditions. It sounds like compared to you guys have in Texas, we don't have snakes or, you know, alligators or whatever. We did not have to worry about that. And actually the initial survey period was, we had relatively few biting insects as well. They did come on later as you get into June though. But the night surveys were quite peaceful and nice. But they are in the middle of the night.
Okay, cool. One other question. What farming practices did you observe along the Arkansas River, and how compatible was that with your wetlands with black rails?
The farming practices?
Yeah, I mean, are tractors rutting things up, or are they getting in the way, or is it compatible completely with black rails?
No, I think, you know, the marshes that are there, I think are largely there and going to be there. I don't think the agricultural practices in terms of cultivation are affecting marshes at this point. You know, what does affect the marshes and the kind of the marsh expanse and the area that's available to black rails is our water levels. You know, these areas, these really large cattail marshes are associated with John Martin Reservoir, which is a large reservoir along the Arkansas and is used for water control and irrigation. And this year, actually, because Colorado is going into a drought, they stored a lot of water in John Martin this year, which backed up water fairly high into areas that haven't been flooded in the past. And then other areas, you know, the water's way down. Other years, the water's way down, and so you have more kind of shallow water areas available to black rails. So I think more water management is different.
Okay.
With the effect of these areas more than actually cultivation. But that's just my initial thought.
Okay, great. We have a couple questions that were submitted. Let me read those to you, Liza. Okay, question number one, how did you define contiguity when delineating marsh patches? What was the maximum distance that marshes could be separated, i.e. 1 pixel or 100 meters or what?
So it was definitely more than 100 meters. It was, they were separated by a fair amount, but that rulemaking is a difficult kind of issue to get at, and that's somewhere where I think we really could improve our work moving into the future. You know, I'd like to collect marsh size in the field, whether it's using a GPS, or although some of the marshes are really large and would be really hard to map using GPS, or potentially, you know, with new technology using drones or the unmanned aerial vehicles. But the rule set of defining marshes is difficult, but they were separated, you know, by, I don't know, at least 500 meters.
Okay, great. Another question is about your nocturnal surveys. Was there background noise issues with frogs? We can't read the rest of it, but maybe frogs, machinery, any background noise issues to detect the black rail?
No, that was one of the nice things about the nighttime surveys. You know, the background noises were relatively quiet. Everything was calm.
We did have some places with frogs, but we could still detect the black rails. I do think that's one reason why our detection probability at dawn is lower, is because at dawn you've got all the marsh birds out there singing, and it's really loud just with bird noise. So I think that's one reason why detecting black rails is more difficult in the dawn surveys.
Okay,
There's,
great.
Some of the points were along highways, and we did have a few issues with background noise from vehicles, but it's relatively unpopulated out there.
Great, Liza. I want to come help in Colorado.
Yeah, no, it's really neat area, really neat marshes.
Perfect. Well, we don't have any more questions right now for Liza or Whitney, but if you guys do have questions at a later point, or you just think of something, well, Amanda just said she wants to join you too, Liza, so she's going to be packing her bags and heading to Colorado to see you. But if you guys do have any more questions at any point, please do reach out to the presenters, either Liza or Whitney, and I'm sure that Cliff will be more than happy if you reach out to him as well. He'll be able to direct you in whatever way you need to go to get the information you need. I would also like to thank everyone for just participating in the webinar. It's been a pleasure working with you guys, and it's great to have 3 different time zones at least for presenters, and I'm sure for audience members on this webinar. So I look forward to seeing what comes out on Friday and keeping in touch with you guys. But I'm sure that Cliff here in Texas is going to take the lead and pull things into the future. So if you have any questions, most definitely reach out to him. Anything else you want to add?
No, thanks everybody.
All right. Well, thank you, and we're going to try to share this webinar with you shortly.